Reactive Training Systems.
Welcome back to the RTS Podcast. I'm Coach Mike, and today I'm talking to Coach Mark and Coach John. And we were talking offline about lessons learned and coaching conceptually, coaching very broadly. And Mark brought up a good topic we thought would be a good conversation for a podcast. Mark, I think probably the best way to get in on this would be to just have you lead off the conversation just kind of the way that you did before. So kind of let you take it away from there.
Okay.
That's
Yeah,
all right.
sure. Yeah, I started with the analogy. So as far as powerlifting goes, I guess I'm more advanced, been doing this a long time, but I started just as a way to relax, planted a garden this past summer. I've been around gardens and helped out with gardens with my parents and all that stuff, but I never really took it from start to finish, like planting seeds and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to basically learn. So starting as a novice gardener, and it's now October and everything's pretty well done, I think I accomplished what I wanted to as far as learning goes, because you don't know what you don't know, obviously, to begin with, as a novice. In retrospect, next time I plant a garden, I will do it differently, because I spent a bunch of time on things that didn't yield very good returns on my time, and probably not enough time on things that would have yielded a lot better returns. And so I think that's a huge value in talking to somebody or buddies that have been there and done that. They've been through the learning curve. So I thought this would be helpful to novice, particularly novice, and even in the intermediate lifters, probably not so much veteran lifters, because they're long on the learning curve. But I just see as a fairly common thing, either novice and or intermediate lifters spending time on things that don't really matter that much. And then their focus isn't where I would like to shift their focus for them to get better gains and better returns on what they're doing. And so that's the point of this.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Focusing your attention on where you get the best returns. And early on in your arc through anything, really, in powerlifting in particular, it's difficult to know where that time is best spent. So did you have anything, I guess, from the world of powerlifting, like what's a recent example, maybe from your coaching practice or something like that, of, I guess, a scenario where you could look at it and say, yeah, here's an example of somebody who would be better off if they could shift their focus a little bit in one direction or
I'm going to, not one person, but let's just say a mash of several lifters. Say somebody's really concerned about their belt, their lifting belt. When they're spending all this time and focus on their lifting belt, getting exactly the right belt and all this stuff, but I'm programming something, whatever. Let's say pin squats, but they're not doing pin squats correctly. What's most important here? I don't care about the belt. I do care about, are they doing the pin squats properly? Are they getting out of the pin squats? I want them to get out of the pin squats in order to make good progress. And I shouldn't say I don't care about the belt, but like if they didn't even have a belt, so what? They'd still be getting stronger if they did the pin squats correctly. The belt is just an add-on. It's just an addition. Don't spend your time on that. Yeah, and that's nobody in particular.
Yeah, that's a good example. Sure. Yeah. As I thought about this for a little while, I thought it's kind of hard in a lot of ways to come up with some specifics. You can point to them when you notice them, but just even from like my own personal experience, there's a lot of explicit lessons learned. I'm thinking about competing in particular right now. So I remember early on in my actual competitive career, I would go to competitions and come away with distinct lessons learned. Okay, next time I need to pick my attempts a little more like that. I need to warm up a little bit more like this. But that quickly gives way to less distinct lessons learned that I would come away from a competition feeling like I learned a lot. But if you said, what was it that you learned? It's hard to put it into words. It's an experience thing. It's even now it's hard to put into words, but it would be subtle shifts in timing or a little bit better understanding of how to read signals that are going on around you. Just your ability to notice small things that are maybe not super consequential, but it could be important. To give you an example, at this point in my lifting, I was competing equipped. And after you do a few competitions, you start to notice things like what is a big weight change, like a big weight change between attempts, because you've got to wrap your knees, you've got to time the wrapping of your knees. So if somebody has a small weight change, they only need to put on chips. Well, that's going to be a really fast weight change and probably a fast call for bars loaded. Whereas a big weight change, you might have a few extra seconds. So it's just like a subtle shift in your timing. Not that that's amazingly consequential to the outcome or anything, but it's the noticing of small things that you just have no business trying to notice all those things when you're a beginner. It comes a little bit later. So I think maybe that's a little bit different because we're not talking about focus at that point. We're talking about just the gaining of experience, but I do think those things are connected.
Just to add to that, I think your example makes a lot of sense because when you're starting out, the aha moments are much bigger because they're a bigger deal. They are a bigger lesson learned. They're usually very strong learning opportunities. Like Mark's example of you're worried about a belt when you're actually not doing this movement correctly. That's a very big skill gap that needs to be filled. Whereas the timing of wrapping your knees as an equipped lifter, it's a much smaller skill gap. But the interesting thing is that actually matters so much to your performance. Whereas I'd argue the beginner lifter that is programmed pin squats who learns how to do it correctly is going to get far more out of that than they are of like picking the absolute right belt. So like part of it is, I think as you get more and more experience, the details matter. Like we've talked about this in other podcasts with Dr. Kristen Lander talking about nutrition. That matters. Like eating a meal before you lift and the right meal for you, that's going to matter, right? Like that's an important detail that maybe you could argue when you're first starting out is less important because the skill gap is so wide, right? And so all of those details matter. How you construct training, how you're peaking into a meet, even down to the warming up and how you're wrapping your knees in between attempts. Like all those small details actually could mean the difference between you hitting the loads that you need to hit for your goals, whether that's a podium finish, a national team selection opportunity, or potentially even breaking a record or something. But when you're first starting out, you're not really thinking about those things, nor should you, right? It's like, how do I execute?
And it's, I think, like the saying, somebody's majoring in minors. And that's the point of this podcast, is because when you're a novice, you don't know what's a major and what's a minor, right? You don't know. So whereas an experienced lifter, like your example, Mike, that's you've already covered the majors. Now you're trying to get what you can out of the minor details.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. As I think about where this stuff happens on the arc of a lifter's career, your trajectory, I would have pegged a lot of this stuff as being still like early intermediate, at least from a competitor standpoint. And even to that end, there's a lot of training lessons learned, programming lessons learned that are still occurring, big stuff that's still occurring 10 years into writing my own training. I would say that things have gotten to be a lot more detail oriented in the last 5 years. I think it's hard to say that when all the low hanging fruit has been exhausted, because what do you mean by that? It's an analogy that's dependent on how we're defining these things. But I would say in the last 5 years, I'm focusing on more and more details that I don't necessarily expect to get a large return. I'm definitely expecting more modest returns. But up until that point, that's a pretty long arc where there's a lot of stuff to learn that can still provide significant benefit. And even now, like I'll get surprised by stuff. John, you brought up the discussion around nutrition, how that's evolved in powerlifting culture, because nutrition was a thing that powerlifters didn't really need to worry about that much through most of the 90s and 2000s. At least that's what we thought. And then the culture shifts, things become more competitive, and people actually find, hey, if I give a bit of attention to my nutrition, then I'm getting a benefit from it. And now I'd say we're at the point where people pay a significant amount of attention to nutrition and they're seeing benefits from it. So to be fair, it was always that way. This is a cultural shift more than a physical one. But that's something that as that shift has happened, I've kind of ridden that wave along with pretty much the rest of powerlifting, I think. And I've noticed the benefit too. Would it have been better if I had paid some attention to that earlier on in my career? Maybe you can make the argument, yeah, but a lot of this whole conversation is based on the assumption that you can only pay attention to so much at once. You have to form some habits before you can take your conscious attention and focus it elsewhere. It's too much to do. We talk about over cueing a rep, where we give a lifter too many things to think about in a single rep. And I think you could probably do that with just about anything. Don't forget your pre-workout. Don't forget your post-workout nutrition. Don't forget to get this much sleep, and don't forget to do that. Don't forget to meal prep. Don't forget. And in the meantime, the person's like, hey, I don't even know if I like this.
Kind of triage to a certain extent. It's what is the thing in front of me that I might want to focus my efforts and intention on that would yield me the best result, knowing that I probably can't focus on everything all at once. Going back to Mark's analogy of the garden, first year in running his own garden, there's a lot of things that you could be doing, right? Like you could be looking at soil pH, like you can go real crazy with it, right? But if you had to triage, is it companion planting? Is it measuring the soil pH? Is it like, what is the thing in front of you that would bring the greatest return? And that's a hard question. It's a hard one to answer. What I think about as an analogy for me is like, I've been working on doing some mechanics, working on my vehicle, my son's vehicle, and I don't know what I'm doing, but you know what? I know people that do. And so that's where I go. And so I go for expertise somewhere outside of me, someone who's got 30 years doing this, 40 years, 50 years. And they can be like, hey, you're paying attention to the minor stuff. Don't just start throwing money at parts and doing this. Let's run some diagnostics. Let's do this. And that's when you can, if you put this to powerlifting for a second, if you go back to Mark's example of the lifter who's worried about a belt, they've come to you, Mark, to ask you a question about it for your knowledge so that you can guide them. And I think from a coaching perspective, that's one of the biggest values that we can add as a coach, is to be able to say, hey, you know what, this probably will matter at some point, but right now, this is actually a bigger opportunity for us to get that out. So I'm curious, actually, like Mark and Mike, how do you guide lifters in that direction? How do you help to triage the most important things?
I can jump in here, Mark, if you want. I think what you're getting at, John, is kind of what we would term the leadership quality from coaching, right? That I think that's essentially what coaching is. Even you could make the argument that even down to writing a program is prioritizing, right? That we have finite resources, time and recovery, and this is how it's best spent, is doing this program and things like that. But then there's a lot of things that go into a performance that's not the program. The belt example is one. Technical changes. I was watching a kid squat. A kid, he's probably a grown man, but I don't know. Watching somebody squat in the gym that I'm training at the other day. And I noticed some things that looked to me like, I don't know if they were necessarily technical flaws, but they were idiosyncrasies with his technique that you wouldn't necessarily teach. And it got me thinking about, would time, if I was his coach, I am not, would time be better spent changing those things or doubling down on kind of his natural tendencies? So that's an open question, and it's a question that's not got a clear answer as far as I can tell, and it's something that I can't algorithmically work through the math. There's still a lot of judging by feel going on, and kind of leaning on your experience, which isn't all explicit knowledge. So I don't know, but I do think that all those things like that kind of come back to leveraging the experience of somebody who's been down these roads before. And I would make the argument that's where RPE came from in the beginning, as I was coaching the Air Force Academy powerlifting team. And I'm thinking, how do I raise the level of training for all my teammates? And all the things that I'm reading at this time are talking about learning to listen to your body. How do you do that? There's no really way to teach you to do that. It just takes experience. You got to lift for 10 years and you just figure it out. And me being dissatisfied with that answer and eventually coming up with an RPE system and leveraging the knowledge that I come across and learned from others as well. But that the point of it was to teach intermediate level powerlifters how to read the signals. That's the point. It's a tool to help you do that. And you could make the argument that lots of the tools that we've developed have been for that purpose. Take an emerging strategy approach to training. Experienced lifters do have a tendency to just figure out over time what exercises they're responding best to. They notice that, hey, my bench is always better when I'm training with higher intensities and I cut out more of the volume work. They notice stuff like that. How can you do that systematic? How could you do that without taking a huge amount of time? Can you speed up this process? Yeah, I think this comes back to the coaching process quite broadly.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, with all of it. I think you've been very successful in accomplishing that, Mike.
Thanks. Yeah, it's kind of a case by case in my experience that we have to address each of these problems one by one. Like you take some things that can be given a more formulaic process. Auto-regulating the load with RPE can be fairly formulaic, but then other things, not so much. Should you bench with a wider grip or a closer grip? We know tendencies, and that's fine, but we're talking about dialing that in for an individual. Or should you turn your toes out or try to assume a more back position when you squat? Know what the general consensus on these things is, but then how do you figure that out? I know for probably lots of us, when it comes to coaching technique at all, that's always a struggle because you have technical idiosyncrasies between lifters and you don't want to try to shoehorn them into some top-down technical paradigm that's not really going to work for them. But at the same time, you don't want to be technique agnostic either. You don't want to just ignore technique and pretend it doesn't matter. There are optimizations to make. So how do you do that? It's this process of working through it. You make a change, you test the result, or you can occasionally do some diagnostics. Like I know Dr. Megan Jones does these with Kinetic Advantage Consulting, that one thing about her process is that she'll watch attempts and she'll look for degradations over successive attempts. So as you go from your first squat to your third squat in competition, she's looking at how does your technique break down with load, and that gives some insights. But it's still this iterative process. Like, okay, I see that you're doing this. Try turning your toes out a little bit more, or try really pushing into your knees a little bit. Okay, well, that didn't really work. Was it the cue that didn't really work? Or is this technique just not really meshing with your constitution?
I was just going to add to that, Mike. This is one of the areas I hear in this conversation is context matters. So we know technique matters. We know programming matters. We know that nutrition matters. We know that all these things matter, right? They all contribute to strength development, but the context is the most important thing probably, right? If we look at a lifter who is a novice trying to talk about all of these things all at once, we know would be overwhelming. And we're better served focusing on technique development and refining of just understanding the basic concepts of the lifts, understanding basically how to do the big three. What's interesting over time is that, and why I brought up the triage analogy, is that as you get more experienced, context is going to matter so much more. So you brought up the example of looking at attempts and saying, oh, what if we just point your toes out? And if you have a top-down model of how technique should be, that sounds about right. But when you're looking at the finer details, could that issue with technique not necessarily be that the cue didn't work, but they have an overactive muscle in comparison to other muscles? And then therefore diving into the program, like we do a lot with Dr. Megan's consultations, we can address some of those overactive muscles and underactive muscles and muscles that need to become stronger because there's a compensatory mechanism where we're shifting loading to stronger muscles. Again, this is where context matters. So where should you focus your time? And when you think about coaching paradigms, one of the coaching paradigms out there is we'll just do the competition lift. Yeah, to a certain extent, that probably works. That probably works really well. And I'm not hating on specificity. I'm all about specificity, but there's a point of diminishing return, right? Like with everything else. And so then therefore, at some point, practicing the competition lift anymore is not going to yield you the result that you're actually after. and you're better suited for ROI purposes, time, energy, recovery resources being put into something like, hey, if we think that your hamstrings are taking up the slack for your glutes, well, then we probably should do hip thrusts or something like that, because then we actually are able to train something that we think is a weak limiting factor for you. And again, the further down the road you go with experience, context is going to matter a lot. I have a lifter who just competed at Masters Worlds, and the list of things that we are focusing on, even though she had an amazing performance and put up the best total she's ever had, the list of things that we're focusing on is growing because context matters at this point. It's like, hey, here are the things that we're noticing. These are the things that we have to focus on. And so then the smaller details become the focusing agent now. It's okay, now we need to finally focus on this thing and finally focus on that, because we've already worked on the competition lift. We have an understanding of what movements work well, right? Like we have an understanding of nutrition and nutritional interventions. Those foundations are already laid. And so now the further we can go down that rabbit hole of fine-tuning the program, weakness analysis and correction, those sort of things, that's actually where her time is best spent. And part of that is because she's already done the base levels of the pyramid, right? She already has that time under the bar. So going back to the question I asked you guys, which was like a trick question, like how do you triage things? Really, the answer is context. What does that lifter need at that time?
Yeah.
Where's their knowledge gaps? Where are their technique gaps? Maybe they need to focus on hypertrophy.
I think, like you said, it's completely context driven. I just try to see what they're doing, like what they're spending their time on. And I'm sure you guys have seen this too, like with novice and even intermediate lifters. Sometimes they get, like a good example, supplements. I'm not saying supplements aren't important, but you and I, we all know that 90% of the stuff that's out there for sale doesn't amount to squat. It's a waste of money. So what is the 10% that actually is worthwhile? And is it worthwhile all the time, or is it just worthwhile for a certain point? There's other things that I would have to say, like I've been having a little bit of a discussion with Mike about magnesium and some electrolytes. They're absolutely essential, like pre-workouts and stuff like that. Don't spend your time on all that stuff. If there's something.
But even then, Mark, like what we've been talking about with magnesium is important, essential, even further down the line. If you're struggling with basic performance of the lift, then we'll focus our attention and we can worry about what comes next further once we've got some of these basics squared away. So it does come back to that pyramid concept.
Yeah, stuff. I just threw together a few thoughts here that I'm going to throw this bomb out there and you guys can pick pieces up and run with it, whatever. But like, to me, the number one thing, as far as wherever you are on the spectrum of experience and so forth, is just show up. Just show up and do something. Even if you're injured, show up and do something. I think that's a big mistake, no matter what stage you are at. If you are making excuses and not showing up and not training, you're not going to make gains that way. And that's a no-brainer.
I wanted to add to that. I think there are probably not too many RTS old timers at this point who will remember Bob. But if you go way back and you remember Bob, one thing that I remember that he did, which I thought was actually pretty smart. Bob had a home gym and he did not put his weights away at the end of his workout. And he did that intentionally so that when he would go back out to the gym and he's ready to start the day's session, the first thing he would do is take 10 minutes and clean up. He put away all yesterday's stuff. And that little bit of moving around would let him, Bob had a ton of orthopedic issues and pain issues, and is a fairly complicated set of circumstances. But that act of going out there and putting away all this stuff would give him some insight on what was going to cooperate, and that he would gauge his training session based off of that. Now, you may not design an approach like that, but I thought, considering the circumstances, that's pretty smart. So thinking about your idea of just show up, yeah, at least get out there and put the stuff away and you see what's available to you. My knee is really acting up today, probably ought not squat. Okay, what can you do? What training can you do that's going to move you toward your goal? And sometimes the answer is going to be just rest, but not that often.
That kind of goes with something Newton Chang has been talking about from the book Win the Day. He talks about that, like finding a way to win the day. And I think the concept of, hey, I'm going to do something. What can I do today? And you know what? Legitimately, sometimes the answer to that is nothing. Sometimes it is. And sometimes actually that is winning the day. Nothing's cooperating. You're feeling really banged up. Motivation's really low. Maybe you're best suited going for a walk. I'd argue that is still doing something, but maybe that is the thing that you ought to do that day. But oftentimes, like you said, Mike, it's usually not. There usually is something you can do. And if you can train your mindset to win the day and do something, well, that's contagious. And that takes shape in you coming to the next session to find a way to win the day. So I'm definitely on board with that, Mark, of just do something and show up.
Yeah, exactly. Then another thing, I've got several here, but is again, being a veteran lifter was a dumbass for about 30 years, still am, but that's beside the point. Trying to balance the parasympathetic versus sympathetic nervous system equation, because if you stay tipped heavily into sympathetic nervous system too much for too long, you're gonna pay for it. There's gonna be a train wreck. So I think that's a big one that, when people fall on both, I think people fall on both sides of that equation. Like some of them aren't working hard enough and some of them are working too hard and I got to try to put the brakes on, but there is an equation and you can't cheat it is the point.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying there is that you need to not come into every session as keyed up as you possibly can. Not every session is, 5-alarm fire, but also you can't come in half asleep either. And also after the session, you've got to turn that off a little bit. You've got to bring things back down. And I think this one is fractal, right? Because there is a more chronic degree of this, like how amped up are you just all the time, and how much are you doing for each training session? But it also goes down to each set too. Like sometimes people are burning a whole lot of energy with kind of these outward displays of, I don't know, peacocking as they approach a set, versus just approach the set and you can turn it on as you're getting under the bar if you want. I think that's something that takes a bit of practice. And it's probably not something that ever really goes all one way or another. I think there's some significant personality components to it that you take some people and they do have that ability to flip the switch on and off pretty regularly. But then other people, it takes a little bit of time for that ramp up. And it depends on how far do you need to go too, because a third attempt, like the psych up that you need for a third attempt deadlift, it takes a few minutes. So you've got to have the time for that spin up, but that's also expensive too from an energy standpoint.
Just to add to that, I think that you're right on the money, Mike, about personality being an important part of this and knowing your personality and what's going to work best for you. Mike, you need to calm down before you squat. I need somebody to get me out of my head a little bit. It's just personality differences, right? And so the powerlifting team slapping you on the back, let's go. I'm going to respond very well to that. I always do. Probably not so much for you, Mike. Like that, it's probably got to be the other way. Let you do your deep breathing and get you ready to go out and take that squat. And that's a thing that you've learned. You've also learned, like, maybe for deadlift, you can amp yourself up possibly. Whereas for me, if I amp up on deadlift, I'm going to screw up my technique. I'm not going to put my hands where they need to be, and I'm not going to get the bar right where it needs to be because I'm too amped. And I think that's ultimately a thing that lifters figure out along the way. And I think that's a great point, Mark, about looking at amping up and cooling off. I think that each lift can be different for the lifter, and I think each person can be different. But certainly there's got to be a hierarchy here. There's got to be something that we can teach people. And I think certainly amping up for every set on one end of the continuum, probably not good. Or coming in half asleep after playing video games, probably not good either, right? There's got to be some sort of middle ground that's right for each individual.
Yeah, and I guess
I think this ties into further conversation that we've had around like the skills associated with training. We talk about needing to manage things that aren't written on the program, that really can't be written on the program. That's one of them. how do you sort out, how much psych up do you need to bring to your opener versus your third attempt? You're going to have to just go down that road, and you're going to have to try it a few different ways, and some are going to work and some aren't. Unfortunately, that's part of the learning process, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. That's part of what you have to do to figure it out. So still something to be said for gaining that firsthand
Yeah,
experience.
and I was referring to like looking at it in a more broad, general sense as well. Like you can have a guy he's got the perfect program, he's executing it perfectly, he's doing everything right, but his progress isn't good because you find out he's only sleeping 4 hours a night and his diet is crappy. That's not something that's programmed, like you just said, Mike. So how important is that? It's very important. It's not programmed. It's not something we can program. They need to take care of that as a lifter that wants to make progress. But if they can't if they're in a situation where they're getting 3 or 4 hours sleep a night and meals are all messed up, that's important. It's very important as far as the recovery part.
Yeah, I had a conversation about this with a friend of mine in response to a similar sort of message from another coach. My friend anyway, took offense to the message a little bit. He's a pretty blue collar type of guy who works a shift job, and a lot of his friends are in a similar sort of situation. And I think sometimes what people hear when we're talking about stuff like this, sleep in particular, is, hey, if you're not sleeping, you're not going to make progress. And I don't think any of us would say that a lack of sleep is a good thing. But if there's one thing I've learned since my daughter was born, is that I can still make progress even if my sleep is not awesome, because my sleep has not been awesome for the last 3 or 4 years now. I don't know. Things are still going along okay. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. And there are things that need to be done. Yeah, things that need to be done to account for it. But it's not like a death sentence on your gains either. Yeah, I don't know. I don't expect that we see things all that differently there, but I wanted to add that point of
Yeah,
clarification.
and that I agree 100%, Mike. If there's one mistake that I made for the first 30 years, whatever it was, overtraining and undereating, basically. If I had known then what I know now, I probably wouldn't have spent 5 hours in the gym a day, and I would have spent, say, 2 hours of that eating instead. So did I make progress? Yeah, I made progress, but it would have been a whole lot better in time. The return on investment would have been much higher had I frickin' eaten. So I think point taken, Mike.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it's just control the controllables, I guess. That would be, if I'm going to pitch in my own sort of submission to things that are worth your attention, it would be that. It would be control the controllables. That there's a lot of worry and hand wringing and everything over stuff that you don't have a say in. How much is the competition going to lift? People spend lots of time and effort scouting the competition. We call it scouting. Really, it's just obsessing over what the other guy's going to lift. There is a such thing as a legitimate scouting report. But if you're doing this weeks and weeks ahead of time, that's not scouting. You're just anxious, and that's fine. But let's call it what it is.
Well,
and that's not controllable.
And to add to that, like you were talking about rest, digest, all that jazz, parasympathetic, sympathetic stuff. Look, for some people, seeing their competition, worrying about what's going on with them is motivational, right? Like that does make you focus a bit. Like, okay, you know what? So-and-so is doing this. You know what? I got to be on top of my game. But for some people, maybe with higher level trait anxiety, that could mean some sleepless nights. That could mean like making mistakes in the gym. That could be worrying about things that you just literally don't have control over. You cannot control how much someone else lifts. And for those individuals, again, it goes back to know thyself. If you have high trait anxiety and that's causing you not to sleep and worry and all this stuff, that's not good for you either. And I'll give you like another concrete example. I had a lifter who consistently worried about making weight, consistently, to the point where they would do some stuff right before the meet and come in drastically underweight. And every time the performance was so variable because I was trying to put my finger on it. I was trying to put my finger on what's going on. Training, we do all these different training interventions, go into the meet, and there's no rhyme or reason. Like squat is just nowhere near where we were. And I just couldn't understand it. And then I started getting into looking at the numbers and how much they were eating and the stuff that they were doing. And it's okay, that makes sense, because if I did that, I'd have trouble performing too. And again, that's where the context is so important, right? Because the person's so worried about making weight. It's, you know what? You need a dietary intervention, probably need to work with a professional here so that you get a plan in order so you're not worrying about this. And lo and behold, they stop worrying about it, had plans, and then they have consistently amazing meets, 2 9-for-9 performances back to back, and are like on the brink of setting PRs because they're not worried about coming in, meeting their weight class, because they've got that under control. There's a plan. And to me, that's, again, context, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's something that's a controllable factor. And to your point about other lifters potentially being motivational, fair enough. But the time for that motivation is not as you lay down before bed.
It's good. It's a good point.
I mean, I think we have the capacity to convince ourselves of lots of things, and that, hey, this thing that I'm doing is good for me, is the thing that is easy to convince yourself of.
I'm just picturing now people watching Mike Teixeira before they go to sleep. They shut their phone off and then they just have dreams about you. I have to be better than him.
No, don't watch the lifting. Listen to the soothing sound of my voice on the podcast. Yeah, I guess let's, Mark, did you have another one that you wanted to toss in?
Read my mind. Oh, actually, yes. One other thing, which is that, and you guys probably see this too, when you program an exercise for a block, and this is particularly true with emerging strategies, obviously, because you're going to be repeating that same thing and it's very targeted and important. We do that. We as coaches program these things with an intention or a purpose for that tool. And if that doesn't come across to the lifter and they don't execute as we intended it, then that tool is not used to its advantage. And so that's lost. And so I think that's an important one as well, is to understand the intent or the purpose. And of course, this goes for anybody that's got a coach. Ask your coach, why did you program this? What am I supposed to be doing? How do you want me to do it to get the right effect? Because I think that's important, really important.
Yeah, this one is definitely a two-way street, that coaches need to communicate well what the intention is behind the things that they put in the program. But then if it's not clear to the athlete, then, speak up and ask. I think it's just people trying to be polite, but lots of times people will ask if it's okay to ask those types of questions. And it absolutely is. Like, the program is going to go better if you understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish with this. Even if we've had discussions before about, for instance, the way that you execute your split squats can vary depending on what you're trying to get out of it. Some things are like that. Some things are much more straightforward than that and don't have a lot of things for the lifter to consciously do differently, but still understanding the intent is going to be beneficial. And it's going to be beneficial anyway from just an execution standpoint, but there's also the not rare situation that will come up, and you need to change your approach for that day. I had a lifter the other day who had pin squats programmed, and when he got to the gym, pin squats were not available. I think the pins in the rack were missing or something like that. So now it has to do something different. And in that moment, he chose pause squats, which could be an acceptable substitution, or it could not be, depending on what the intention of that slot really was. So having communicated like what the intent was, and him having some knowledge around not only what the intent was in the slot, but also some general coaching knowledge himself. He's actually a coach. He was able to make the call, but had some of those components been missing, that becomes a lot more difficult. Hopefully that's not a situation that pops up every week, but it is a thing that happens. And the further down the road you go, the more adaptable you need to be. Athletes with chronic issues, especially chronic issues that come in, hey, this session my back hurts, this other session it doesn't hurt. And being able to adapt on the fly, having an understanding of not only what the intent is, but what are your range of options to meet that intent is pretty central to being able to make the most out of those sessions.
Yep.
Cool. So Mark, I think you said that was your last one. Did you have another one, or?
No, I think that pretty well covers it. Just had one quote. This is a Louis Simmons quote, I think, although I got this secondhand, but I thought it was pertinent. And that is, don't have $100 shoes and a 10-cent squat.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is a Louis quote. Yeah, to me, a lot of this will come back to technical analysis, and that's one of these iterative things that just seems to go better if you've got somebody with knowledge and experience guiding the way. I definitely did not have that when I was coming up, and it took quite a while to figure it out. Leaning on knowledge and experience is highly recommended. John, did you have any parting thoughts that you wanted to include here?
As we were talking, I started jotting down a few notes of what are you spending your time on? I tried to think about that for a moment and what are some of the limiting factors for you in your development? So I wrote down a few. Technical proficiency, which we've covered, muscle mass hypertrophy, energy systems development, being able to just recover from your work. That can be a limiting factor for people. Stress management. You have a very stressful job. You got all these kids that are always asking you questions and demanding things from you. Not talking from experience, wink, wink. That becomes a stressor. Nutrition. We've talked about that several times. Pop-Tarts can only go so far. Supplementation, right? And the role of supplementation. And is half the thing in your medicine cabinet actually helping you or just giving you potential issue when it comes time for drug testing because you bought them at GNC and didn't check the label? Sleep. Are you getting sufficient sleep for you? I was just like thinking through all these things, and I think it's a heuristic, right? We can ask ourselves these questions and like, where are some of my gaps right now? And certainly another one to add to that would just be programming, right? But if you look at it, programming is only one part of all of this stuff. We've said it before, you can have an excellent program, but not be getting enough nutrition or not sleeping enough or not being able to recover from your repeated bouts of exercise and because you're not aerobically trained enough and whatever, or you're not willing to put on muscle mass when it's clearly a limiting factor for you. Programming is only one part of the equation. And I think it is important for us to be thinking about return on investment. And sometimes why is best served focusing on one of these areas versus the other. And probably as far as we get to be like Mark 40 years in through our powerlifting journey, the more details on all of these areas probably matter to move the needle.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers the topic for us. Really appreciate both you guys and your thoughts around this. And if I'm going to kind of try to sum it up as a take home, it would be, like you're saying, John, that context is really important when it comes to figuring out where your time is best spent and that it's worth thinking about the ROI. It's really worth leaning on someone with an outside perspective and preferably lots of experience. That's going to be the best way to fast track to maximizing the return on your focus. All right, guys, appreciate your thoughts and your wisdom here. And thanks everyone for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.